if that's easier too. Amazing. And so here we go. I'm going to start sharing my screen and then sort of get us rolling. Let's see if I can get that done. Cool. I'm going to get a little full screen on us. So can everyone see my screen? I will zoom in at the appropriate times, but
yep, we're seeing the screen.
Amazing. Like I said, I know there's 8 people here in the Miro board, which is amazing. So like I said before, we're going to have a lot of fun with this. You can use any of the emojis while I'm speaking to let me know how I'm going. That'll be the fastest feedback, most shifted left on the feedback possible. These are mostly positive ones. So like love hearts are probably good. You know, I'm going to assume fire means that it's fire and you love it. If you're not really sure what's going on and I'm confusing you, we can use this one here as well. And like we said before, if you're in the Miro board, we've seen like our tab versus spaces war ended up pretty even. So that's cool. That was our little pre-warm up. But if you legitimately have any questions or thoughts, you want to share them as we go, you can use any of the methods we talked about in terms of sharing them in the chat window or even throwing them up here to make them interactive. I'm going to leave some time at the end to do a real quick retro to see how we went, what worked well, what we could improve. But without further ado, I want to introduce the topic for today. We're going to be talking about a well-architected landing zone. We are really going to go over these key items here around the basics for a landing zone. This is going to kind of mix between a generic landing zone that you might want for cloud accounts, but also because this is AWS meetup, we're going to be talking about AWS landing zones specifically as well. I'm going to share some best practices for landing zones in terms of what I'm calling value-focused landing zones in terms of how we can build that out in large organizations. And I'm going to try and share with you some lessons learned over the years after I've had to build landing zones again and again for various clients. As a quick introduction for myself, I'm Andrew Curry. Most people just call me Drew. I work for a consultancy called Contino. I'm a technical principal. I help lead the teams out on the client site to do all sorts of things related to development, cloud, migration to cloud, or even cloud native, anything from testing and even product team focused engagements. But I have had a lot of experience over the years, mostly with AWS in building infrastructure, building and deploying code. And so we're gonna see some of that influence there in some of my recommendations. I'm just going to zoom all the way out right now, just so that you can kind of see what we're going to be going through. I know there's a lot there. I'm just going to be using bits and pieces of this material, and you'll be able to, we're going to link to it later, so you can kind of dive into those areas at any time, either during the talk or even afterwards. So looking good here with the chat. Just as a reminder, up the top here, you can actually click on my name to follow my cursor. If I do get a little crazy, you don't want to follow my cursor, you can actually just unfollow and look at any parts of the board that you want at any time. So let's zoom a little bit in on this agenda before I jump right into it. We have the introduction. We're going to go through what landing zones are, why you might want them, my value focused landing zones that I was talking about. Then we're going to focus right in on AWS, control tower landing zone for AWS, what it was looking like a few years ago back in 2019, and then right up to what are the latest and greatest things in 2022 that you'd want to be focused on. Lastly, we're going to go into some lessons learned, and this is where I'm going to throw a bunch of lessons around cloud account best practices and automation. And I'm just going to kind of summarize with a few principles just to kind of like wrap it up nicely for us. I'm going to try and stop after each of these major sections just to ask if there are any questions, but we actually have plenty of time today, so you're welcome to kind of ask me questions as we go. That's good too. So I think we'll probably be able to get through it in, let's say, 30 to 50 minutes, just depending on how many questions we have, including all of that as well. Alrighty, are we ready to get stuck into it?
Let's do it.
Cool. All right, that's some good positive reinforcement. Love it. Okay, so what's a landing zone? I've used that word a whole bunch of times. Why do you think you might need one? A lot of this is based, these are screen grabs from a blog post I wrote with a colleague a few years back. So a landing zone you might know by another name, might be platform, a foundation, scaffolding, a building block, some sort of platform or factory or control plane. In AWS, they literally use the word landing zone and have a product called control tower. And essentially, these are all very fancy names for talking about how we configure, manage, and secure accounts in the cloud. And so when I talk about cloud accounts, I'm not talking about user accounts like IAM, like Bob or Jane logs into the system. I'm talking about the whole account that has all of the infrastructure in it that needs to be somehow managed and secured and configured in certain ways. So here we go, the creation, configuration, and management of public cloud accounts for enterprise customers in a way that's secure and production ready. That's a definition that we can use for landing zones. You can have landing zones even if you're not enterprise, even if you're not large, and even if you're not production. But typically those are where we see lots of the problems and scale that demand a very robust system that we would call a landing zone. So that's a little bit about what they are. If you're not sold or not sure about whether you need one or not, or you're thinking, do I need to even go down this path? Typically the reasons why you would see yourself go down this path of landing zones is because you're interested in security and compliance, managing accounts, figuring out how you do connectivity, maybe between some on-prem servers, some cloud services, and then in between those accounts that you have. You might have many environments between dev and prod and other, and you want to manage that as well. There's operational concerns like backups, monitoring, etc. There's costs that you want to manage, and you might have lots of different teams and lots of different permission boundaries and separation that you want to manage. So as you can see, these are the sorts of things that if you were going to be entering into the cloud and you had more than one or two applications or one or two people using it, you might start to have all of this kind of overhead that you're trying to figure out how do you manage and how do you scale. Okay, so before I pop over to the next section, are there any questions around like what's the landing zone or why do we need them or anything here that I need to like dive into before I jump into like some of the other pieces? No questions, that's good.
Maybe just a really quick one. So I was at a client site one time where the VPN, well, they were using AWS and they basically had three levels right there: dev, test, and their production accounts. And they set up 3 different VPNs, which required people to figure out how to use 3 different VPNs. And then I've seen it architected where they just had a single landing zone. And I may not be using that word quickly, but they had a single entry point and then you would branch to dev, test, or prod. Is that the kind of thing that a good landing zone would consider? You know, like not having to maintain duplicate infrastructure.
Yeah, correct. And you'll actually, and that's a great topic. Some of the tips that I give are going to be around, what should or shouldn't you be doing. It actually encompasses all the things that you would need to be able to write and deploy code. But with landing zones, we're not necessarily talking about code itself. But I mention that because all those things that you need are networking, environments, connectivity, all those decisions that you make, and then also how you implement that, how you set up and configure that. That's all of what a landing zone is. So you can see there that would be connectivity, maybe some operational, and there's a bunch of architecture decisions that need to be made. So for sure, all those things you're talking about are things that we need to think about how we'd like to do that. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, we can go into a little bit deeper on the topics. So I wanted to start by talking about value-focused landing zones and undifferentiated heavy lifting. A bit of a mouthful. Didn't invent the undifferentiated heavy lifting concept. That actually came from Amazon as a term. But it is an important one to think about. And the key takeaway here is that if your business revolves around, like selling widgets. Let's say, on an e-commerce platform, and you've developed this product and you want to kind of get them out to customers, then the core differentiator for your business might be the product that you make and the value that that brings to people. So what we want to do as a business is try and focus as much of our effort on building our widgets, getting feedback for the widgets, making them better, getting them out to market, maybe having a good margin on those widgets that we sell, all that sort of stuff, right? New features that can beat our competition. If we're focused on infrastructure and managing infrastructure and building out our own platforms that we then have to manage and upgrade and secure, the more we focus on the stuff that doesn't differentiate us as a business, the less advantages we have compared to our customers. And this is some of the concepts about cloud and cloud native, and using something like public cloud. And so in the context of landing zones, the same thing applies. So we want to try and make sure that we do the minimum that we really need to do in a landing zone to get the thing working so that we can deploy our code into it. And sometimes what we've seen, what I've seen with the journey for creating a landing zone in particular, is that particularly in large organizations that might have they might end up having hundreds of accounts that they may need to manage. There may be a lot of thinking and planning and trying to perfect what a landing zone would look like and trying to make lots of decisions up front before companies even think of migrating to cloud, before they deploy their first application to the cloud. So in terms of what is a value focused landing zones, and why is thinking about the approach important even before we get into any of the decisions, it's to say that you probably shouldn't spend 12 months or 2 years trying to think about what all of the perfect decisions are to make before you deploy your first application. You should actually try and find a really good application you can start with, figure out what its needs are, and what is the bare minimum you can build to support that application. For example, you may want to try and get something out if you're a large organization, let's say in a few months or 3 months, with one application, as close to production as possible, if not production. Get some feedback from that application, figure out what some of the missing pieces are, and then start to make those decisions over time, start to build new features over time. Where possible, and we're going to go over this when we talk about the next section with AWS, where possible, leveraging other services from other providers rather than building your own, so that you don't have to manage too many things, too many operating systems, too many bits of software that maybe are better managed and automated and scaled for you. So there's that concept in value-based landing zones in saying we can actually have different waves, but we should be deploying applications, every single chance we get to get feedback from what those applications are needing. What we'll probably find is we have some ideas about what we might need when we move to cloud, or if we're building out in cloud, but we won't know until we start migrating those applications. So very short topic, very simple concept, but maybe a little bit different than some organizations are used to sort of planning out. Any questions there around undifferentiated heavy lifting, or that concept of just value focused sort of landing zones or cloud accounts?
Yeah, Andrew, what are some examples of decisions you see your customers taking too long to make? Like you mentioned, the 12-month planning cycle. That's probably not what you want to do. What do you see your customers get stuck on, and how do you talk them into deferring those decisions so that you all can start getting into the implementation and delivery of value more quickly?
Sure, yeah. So let's pick on Kubernetes. This is a fun one, right? So you're entering into the cloud. You're like, okay, well, we need to deploy to Kubernetes. Maybe you're used to owning and managing all that software infrastructure yourself. And a lot of customers will look at it and have an operations team or a DevOps team and say, well, our DevOps team is going to need to really understand Kubernetes, which is great, but you might get stuck down the path of we're going to install Kubernetes, what's called the hard way, ourselves, right? Bring up some EC2 servers because they look like VMs and we're used to those, and they'll try and install and manage Kubernetes and all of the configuration that sort of comes with it. And the problem with that is that we might get worked up in the Terraform modules to build out and manage our clusters. And then we'll look at things like a service mesh. What's the latest one that we should be using? You know, something like Kubernetes has like 10 to 15 to 20 key choices that you need to make to get the whole thing, you know, working swimmingly and nicely. And what you'll find is that you could spend 6 to 12 months trying to do that. And Kubernetes will update really quickly over that time period. So you then need to figure out how you can seamlessly update and manage all of your servers. So if you go down that path, you'll probably spend more time figuring all that stuff out, where in contrast, every cloud provider, including Amazon, has one or more options for managing Kubernetes for you.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's a really good example. I like the example of, you know, getting stuck on Kubernetes, because I think anyone who's used it has gotten stuck on some, if not many, facets of it. So great answer. Thanks for that.
Yeah, no problem. Like there's a whole bunch that we could, a whole bunch of decisions kind of similar to that. Like, should we even be looking at Kubernetes, or maybe a higher level cloud native? Like maybe some of our applications should run in Lambdas. There's even less infrastructure to worry about there. You know, maybe we even tackle Kubernetes when we're ready for it. So a lot of those decisions come down to, what do I need right now? And oftentimes what we'll do in organizations is say, oh, we've got 300 applications. We need to migrate them to the cloud, and try and make too many decisions up front. So picking 1 or 2 applications, focusing on their needs, will help you figure out, you know, what are the minimum choices we need to make for today.
Yeah, that makes sense. Awesome. Great. Thanks for that.
Okay.
Drew, one other question. This is Kyle Heisner. I work with quite a few customers that are in you know, been in the cloud for 8-9 years. You know, they hear the latest and greatest thing about, you know, landing zones or, you know, control tower. Most of them speak control tower now. And, you know, I see a lot of the newer companies that are just now building out, they start with control tower from the beginning, and it's easy. Is the heavy lift piece that you're talking about also the decision to, should I waste the time on moving to control tower now after I've already built everything out? Or is that not something that you see very often?
So the heavy lifting, definitely, that's one great example. So heavy lifting in terms of how we do our landing zones, and that can be applied to so many other things like Kubernetes and other pieces as well. But specifically, what I'm hearing is that there's actually a decision to make. You know, if you've already gotten to a point where maybe you haven't automated all of your landing zone, and you want to figure out, how would I migrate to something that is automated, like control tower? And so yes, there is a trade-off there. And I think what you'd have to come down to is, well, how automated is the stuff that I have today? You know, if it's close to automated, if it's close to immutable infrastructure, like we're going to talk about later, it may be an easier path to say, okay, we build a whole new set of Amazon accounts using control tower, and then we migrate our infrastructure and deployment code over there and deploy to the new. Not without its pain points for cutover and all the rest of it, but definitely possible. If, however, you started off some or very manual, you know, like you were clicking around in the console, or you did a whole bunch of pieces that have changes that you haven't got in code for your infrastructure or accounts, then it becomes difficult. It's a concept of like, what's the reverse engineer? How do I figure out what we've actually done? And that's a more difficult path, and you're going to have to really do a business case to go, you know, how much time and effort can we invest, and how important is it to figure out the manual things that we've done and then migrate that over piece by piece. That's a, you know, more bespoke, difficult conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Drew, it's Michael, Australia. Just on that question, I mean, how many organizations are you coming across that are still in that, you know, clicking through the console and doing everything quite bespoke, as opposed to the latest and greatest in deploying pipelines and getting everything deployed in an automated fashion? What's the mix you serve in the US? So firstly, Michael, thank you for being Aussie and speaking up. I'm a fellow Aussie. If you haven't figured that out from the accent, I usually have that as my intro. But I am living in the US at the moment for the last few years. So I do have a great perspective, at least, of like what's recent in the US, plus back in Australia. What I found myself is that, you know, more so now in 2022,
A lot of people have come into the cloud. A lot of people have started automating their infrastructure and accounts to some degree. Very different to, let's say, 5 years ago, when it was either more manual, or we didn't have a lot of these services like Control Tower being very mature, and a lot of the infrastructure as code being, as well thought out and available as it is now. But I still see clients that have a lot of write access and a lot of manual access to the AWS console. Even if there are automated pieces, it's still rare to be seeing like 100% automated infrastructure and like self-service provisioning of accounts. Some of these organizations are in that kind of like either thinking about how they migrate certain pieces, or have migrated certain pieces and left others. So it's getting better, but I wouldn't say it's all perfect and nothing to do here. It seems like there's always a little bit more that needs to be done.
That's good to know. Thanks, mate.
Yeah, definitely worlds apart from, like I said, 5 years or so ago, when it wasn't even a thought process. You'd get a bunch more manual stuff. You'd have to really explain lots of these concepts. You'd really have to, sell people on why they even want to go into the cloud and what they would do there. Nowadays, it's like everyone, almost everyone's sold on that. Yes, there's value in the cloud, and we've got a bunch of stuff there. We've automated pieces, but we want to do more. What's the next thing? And that's probably a great segue into a little bit more about landing zones and Control Tower. This is kind of like a little bit of a product review. So back in about 2019, we got to have a bit of a play around with landing zones, like I did personally, and I think in the rest of the world, a bunch of us were doing it. It looked kind of like this. There was a bunch of CloudFormation. It would help you provision out these core accounts that were necessary operationally to secure your cloud accounts. And the CloudFormation created a bunch of these services. AWS Service Catalog was used to create this factory, this concept of an account factory, where we could have self-service creation of even more accounts. So I'm not going to go into the whole blog post and the screenshots because it's quite detailed, but you kind of follow along and see what it was like, 2 or 3 years ago. Having said that, it was good, but there weren't a lot of extra features. After the CloudFormation was done, you kind of got left with the other AWS services. So if we kind of fast forward to 2022, so Control Tower has an automated setup, policy management, and dashboards and other features. They have this concept of guardrails that we're going to talk about, for governance. And they're really trying to build in, just like they started off with 2019, try and build in the best practices for architecture and account design and IAM and other things that you need. Trying to build that into this product so that you don't have to spend all that time configuring your accounts. So there's two pieces, like, is your stuff automated or not? But the other piece is like, how do you know all those decisions you need to make about configurations, and does every customer have to start from scratch on that? So a lot of the work in the last few years from Amazon in these products, and really the accumulation of many, many years since Amazon started all those years ago, even though there's choice about doing whatever you want in Amazon with all of their products, we really want to get to a point where some of the obvious choices we can kind of pick from. And that's what we're doing with Control Tower. So one of the examples is like, what are the OUs that we use? It's a bit of a mouthful. So security OU, sandbox OU, and thinking about what that looks like, auditing accounts, log archiving. Like, a lot of this stuff is going to be the same or almost the same for everyone that wants to have Amazon accounts, thinking about security and logging and shared accounts and different roles. So Control Tower kind of helps with a lot of those defaults, and underpinned by that is that concept of landing zone within Control Tower. So in 2022, the two key highlights that I wanted to mention is that Control Tower is a more robust product that actually exists in contrast to a few years ago, and it supports Terraform. So if anyone If anyone's a fan of Terraform, nowadays it's fairly popular. So being able to manage this through Terraform, something that wasn't possible a few years ago, only just came out with CloudFormation. So you can see here, there's a whole slew of AWS services. There's still catalog. There's Control Tower, which is sort of the product in the GUI that runs everything. We've got vendor accounts, but we have Terraform helping out here with the account customizations and other various pieces. So very exciting to see the maturity there. Very exciting to see that announcement around Terraform in Control Tower and Landing Zone. One of the other pieces that I really personally liked, so if you've ever, even if you haven't called this landing zones, if you've ever had to worry about infrastructure, VPCs and networking within AWS, if you've had to configure that stuff in any way, shape or form, you've been working on what's called a landing zone. And, you know, I can probably losing count of the various times where I've had to set up, you know, tens of accounts and even more, and figure out what's the networking look like, what risk profile does this organization have, and how do we connect back to their on-prem, and do they have firewall products that they need to use, and what are their requirements? Built numerous Squid proxy servers, which is a bit of a pain in the butt, to be honest. So recently, in the last year or so, we've seen AWS Network Firewall product come out, right? And AWS Network Firewall allows us to have much more control over the traffic coming in and out, which is typically what we would do with a Squid proxy, where we would want to like review and inspect URLs and figure out if we want to allow certain outbound traffic. So that's now something that's baked into Landing Zone and Control Tower. It's also just a service that you can use if you're building out in Amazon yourself. And that's one of the key products. If anyone remembers back to the NAT gateway as well, there was a time I remember building out, essentially NAT gateways on EC2s, because you had to do that because there was no service. And now there's a service for that. So we've come a long way. We're in 2022, and a lot of these services, undifferentiated heavy lifting, a lot of these services for NAT gateways, network firewalls, are just products that Amazon have that are highly available, that they update themselves. So when you kind of add on the landing zone concept and Control Tower, which includes not only the landing zone but the account vending and the guardrails, we start to have lots and lots of this kind of heavy lifting done for us. So there's a very long piece that I'm not going to go through. It's just a snippet of the Control Tower blog post from 2019. I am going to probably pick out a few key screenshots here, though, just to give you a bit of a sense for those that maybe haven't seen Control Tower in the flesh. So when we say there's a dashboard, it will give you an environment summary. What environments or accounts do you have? What guardrails do you have? Let's see if we can find some more interesting things. Specific guardrails that we're going to go into in a little bit more detail. Organizational units. OUs is something that you just manage in AWS, but if you're doing it through Control Tower, it gives you a nice view of everything that's happening. Your account factory, that's the vending piece. So there's obviously settings for that. There's a GUI for these pieces. So before Control Tower, we just had the CloudFormation, and we didn't have as many of these things. But having said that, even when they launched, Service Catalog was the thing that allowed for self-service account creation for product teams or development teams. And that's a really great concept that isn't new. It's not the last 6 months. Something that's actually been around for years now. A really nice way. This was my introduction to Service Catalog, by the way, which is another great Amazon product. They don't pay me to promote their products, unfortunately. I just do it for love. Okay, so we've got lots and lots of things. I'm not going to go through that whole blog post, but it's a really cool one if you do want to dig a bit deeper. So that was our little summary of the Amazon related products. Let's see how we're doing for time. We're kind of doing okay. I might stop here and see, are there any questions about AWS products here around the landing zone before I go on to some recommendations and principles?
So just a question on the control plane. So that the control plane, we can create different like orgs, if there are different departments in the company, you'll be able to create different access controls. This set of people will be able to access only these AWS accounts and all those things.
Yep. So it really just leverages existing Amazon terminology for organizational units, the policies around that at the account level, and then obviously roles for IAM, and it's going to come pre-baked with a number of different roles. Control Tower itself is adding more and more sort of customization to what it can do for you in that space, and you can also still use your AWS account like you normally would. To manage any of the hundreds of services and any of the IAM and security around it. But yes, it does encompass account and user permission and policy. It's got a real big focus on the OUs, organizational units, the policies, and the user groups. And there's a lot of really cool, sensible defaults for what you could use. So audit, log accounts, that sort of stuff that match up with, those user accounts that match up with the higher level organizational accounts.
Good, thanks.
Really cool, good questions. Yeah, and so like some other examples when we dig into this is that we see we've got Control Tower, it's got its own account. There's OUs that are core versus some of the networking pieces it has to set up. And then there's those business units, which is on the right here, which is going to be where your applications are deployed to. So there are some special AWS accounts that get created as part of this process that just help, manage this product itself, but also to help manage the core networking fundamentals, the security and logging fundamentals, these kind of one-time accounts. And they're very different to the vended accounts. So the accounts that we do vending through the factory, those are the product accounts that product teams, development teams use, and so those concepts and constructs, that's all the heavy lifting and the hard work that everyone needs to do, and a lot of that is like, let's call it 90% same. You're all going to need a networking account. You're all going to need to vend arbitrary business unit accounts. So that's the beauty of leveraging that.
Yeah. So Corey, been doing a lot of well-architected reviews, and that's why I really kind of logged in tonight. I saw the topic. I was like, oh, interesting how well-architected will play into Control Tower and landing zones. So now I kind of really understand, because the number one thing in a well-architected review that always comes up in the first piece is the organizational settings, and, having the workloads distributed correctly to be able to, have IAM access and, everything. So this is actually really interesting how it does that setup for you and gives you more. It's more of a managed service even at that layer. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. It doesn't actually operate as a managed service, but it's almost like,
it's like a building block, though, that makes you follow best practices. Yeah,
that's a great way to put it, right? And it actually is that accumulation of the feedback from well-architected framework, right?
Yep.
And in some ways, it's maybe what AWS should have been doing from day one, right? They gave us all the building blocks. They said, you can do whatever you like with any of these services. And then we kind of all started to realize, but all of us are going to end up doing very similar things. We want to know the best practices way of setting these up. Like, we all need networking accounts. We all need security accounts. And all the recommendations, out of the framework, well-architected framework, was every recommendation is going to be, well, you need to separate out your logs into like a read-only account where all your logs go. And account boundaries are a great way to do that. And you probably want a networking account that's separate, unless you are producing one app one time with one person. You kind of want these structures. So yeah, the outputs of all those learnings over the years come into this best practice, and that's the really cool part about this offering, is that Amazon really dedicated a lot of effort to go, well, if you want a best practice starting point, here it is, and then you can alter it as you go afterwards.
I like it. And the other piece that everybody always struggles with is the governance and the cost control. You think of a SaaS company and trying to, the margins are thinning, and, if your infrastructure if you're overpaying by 30%, just on the infrastructure alone, which most companies are, by the way, everybody is so unoptimized, right? That, you get that problem. And whenever you start dividing it down to an organizational unit and a business unit, and they're responsible for their cost, I think you'll get a lot more governance along that. That's what I see as another benefit to this.
That's a good point. And that's kind of almost like a hark back to our earlier question around, well, what if I haven't set it up this way from the start and I have to migrate towards something like this? That might be some really use cases towards it. If you start off like this with everything fully automated with the organizational units, the tags, etc., it's much easier to understand what's going on. If you've got any kind of concept of not having automated your accounts, there may be sprawl. You might not have full understanding. It's not great from security. It's not great from like consistency of your environments and obviously cost as well. Okay, all right. So that was a real big AWS focus there, and like some of the history around like well-architected reviews and frameworks, and how this product evolved from landing zone and control tower. And so if we're ready, I'd love to change gears a little bit and a little bit more holistically talk about like lessons learned in building landing zones in general, and what I think makes a great landing zone. I'm very surprised we don't have lots of emoji usage. It's such a cool thing. I only learned about it today, so there we go. I can see a few smiles there as well. All right, cool. We're nice and primed. So I'm really just going to talk about the stuff in bold. I'm going to talk sort of off the cuff, and I'm probably going to get very excited and passionate about this. And this is almost my, my must-haves and my very opinionated way of doing landing zones. So obviously, cloud accounts should be provisioned automatically, and they should include guardrails, and developers should be able to have self-service provisioning of their own cloud accounts. Those first three are very much covered by AWS Control Tower and Landing Zone. So cloud accounts should be automated, meaning that we shouldn't have any manual clicking into the console to create and manage an account. Guardrails is a very fancy, fluffy kind of word, right? When I say guardrails, when a lot of other people say guardrails, one of the ways to think about the guardrails are what are the sensible defaults, in particular around security, that we need to think about, that we need to implement in terms of configuration. And for cloud accounts, guardrails for cloud accounts is what are all the things I need to and want to configure in my cloud accounts to protect teams, developers, product teams, so that they don't all have to learn the hard way. So what do we mean by that? Well, there are stories of people going into AWS, using a service like S3 buckets, which is a lot of fun. It's amazing. But maybe they put some stuff in there that they didn't want to make public, but they didn't realize it was public. You don't want every single product team learning that lesson the hard way. You don't want to have a whole bunch of secrets or other information that you don't intend for everyone to see accidentally shared with the world. This is not theory that I'm talking about. It's actual stuff that's happened. Plenty of people have stuff in public buckets that they really didn't want in there. So Control Tower has that concept of guardrails, and this is a screenshot of a particular guardrail that you actually just ensure is enabled. So you can enable or disable that guardrail. So Control Tower, the product, gives you that GUI to work off to then go and implement and make sure that's automated everywhere with all of the, used to be CloudFormation, but now some of the Terraform that's running behind the scenes to make that happen. What are other guardrails, I hear you ask? Well, straight from Control Tower, we can, take a look at any of these. Maybe we want to make sure that encryption is set up for volumes that are attached to EC2s, right? Every time I talk with a client, depending on their risk profile, but regardless of the risk profile, it's very rare to hear of a client that, when I talk to their security team or whatnot, they go, oh, sure, leave the volumes unencrypted. In fact, people, if anything, are more nervous when migrating to the cloud. So they may raise the standards of what they expect compared to what they may have had on-prem. We're going to talk a little bit about this RDP and SSH access. Well, actually, should we enable that over the internet? Strongly recommend that you don't. That's what a control tower recommends as well. So in lots of well-architected frameworks and landing zones, we look at ways of accessing servers through private links rather than over the internet to reduce that attack vector. I'm probably going to go one step further with my recommendation and say that we should disable RDP and SSH on servers completely. We shouldn't even have it installed. It's a lofty ideal to get to. So that was guardrails. I just wanted a few more concrete examples of what people typically mean with that. Now I'm going to get even more crazy. I'm going to say cloud accounts should be read-only for day-to-day access. That includes the CLI and that includes the GUI. Really, the only exception might be a sandbox account that's not connected to your core systems, but the sandbox account's a separate account. You might want to have full access to play within your service through the GUI, click around. That's cool. But for your typical accounts, for your dev all the way over to production, my opinionated stance is let's go read-only by default. However, I hear some people saying in their minds, but we need to get in there and do some stuff sometimes. I need to have write access. Maybe I need to play around with some data in the database, or I do need to have access to a server or change something immediately. Some major bugs, live in production, it's costing us $1 million an hour. And a whole bunch of check-ins is just not where we're at right now, and we do need to do some stuff. So that concept is a concept around break glass, right? So the break glass concept for write access might look like this if you're doing a break glass for an EC2 server, but you can also do that just for CLI write access. And we're in 2022, we've got lots of great developers and development efforts that we could be doing. So you can actually, with Amazon's tools, you can automate a process via a script that says, hey, every developer has read-only access by default. But if they run this script, and maybe if they put in a ticket number, like a Jira ticket number or some other sort of thing that we can log, they can actually have break glass access. And by doing that, they'll get temporary credentials to log in and have write access in production if they need it, because they're fixing some emergency bug. However, we can use the audit trail to figure out exactly what was done in that time period. We're going to talk about immutable infrastructure in a second that might actually revert any of those manual changes eventually if they've happened. And the security team should be aware of what's happened, why it happened, etc. If you have fully automated landing zones from day one, if you have fully automated infrastructure pipelines with only read access to human beings, to users from day one, and if you have the immutable infrastructure with a break glass concept, then in sort of my view, you've got the best of all worlds there. And what you're really driving is the automation of all of your infrastructure so that every environment operates the same. You don't have any of those manual changes sort of sneaking in there in the regular course of development. And I did brush on immutable infrastructure. So mutable versus immutable infrastructure. Mutable would be I log on and make some changes to the server, or make some changes to the definition of the server, and the server stays there, but maybe the size changes or the other properties change. That server might actually live for quite some time. It never gets terminated or destroyed. Immutable talks about making sure that every change creates a new bit of infrastructure, destroys the old server, new one comes up. A lot of Amazon services are built such that they could use the immutable model if you operate in that way. The great thing is you don't have any reboot surprises. Computer's been alive and running for 3 months, 3 years, whatever it is. If you've got a really solid Linux machine, if you can keep your machine up and running for a long time, sometimes it's a bad thing if there are possibly manual changes. So immutable model plus the break glass with a regular day-to-day access, which is read-only. This is the nirvana for automated infrastructure. One more thing I'm going to come back to is the bonus points for not having any remote or SSH access to servers by default. If you can get away from having EC2 servers and use a higher level abstraction, something that's more cloud native, maybe a cloud hosted Kubernetes, you might not even need to have SSH or RDP installed on a server, right? You don't have to worry about upgrading that and managing that. There may be use cases for running an EC2 with some bespoke software, but nowadays in 2022, those are probably far and few between. You have to be doing something really special to not be able to run it on some other higher level abstraction. And even if you were running an EC2 server, this kind of concept of that break glass at least says that, you know, it's actually going to be an exception to the norm to run in, so to log in and access that server. It's not something you want to be doing on a daily basis. Okay, well, that was my sort of opinionated / rant about like what landing zones should look like. Probably got a few minutes before the next section where you can tell me how crazy all those ideas are or what your favorite one is.
One thought or comment or your suggestion that maybe we could get away from ever having EC2 instances. I work a lot in the data space, and there are tools out there, products, and the one I'm thinking about is Matillion, and they deploy their product on EC2 instances. And on occasion, we do need to connect with SSH to configure it or to do something with it, but it's I'm using a third-party tool, not developing it myself. So I don't know if, are we as close to, maybe those guys have you know, a roadmap that's going to include the kind of thing that you're talking about, but is anybody else seeing tools out there that you have to bring up as an EC2 instance, or anybody not seeing it anywhere? Does that question make sense?
Oh, totally. Yep. I was leaving some room for others to respond as well.
Yep.
I'll put my 2 cents in.
I definitely see a lot of the tools out there being that way. I've found recently that if you ask them if you could do it on a managed service instead, and you really push them, they'll let you to get away from it. But they always take the easy and lazy route, right? And that's the easy, lazy route. So you just have to push them to be more modern and use microservices and, you know, and be more advanced. So.
Yep. So that's a good point. If you're writing your own software and developing it, you know, the reasons to have to use EC2 are few and far between. If you're not in control of that software, if there's another vendor involved, they may be lagging a little bit versus maybe the industry and be like, yep, we've only got an EC2 server. That's how it works. But it's interesting to hear that you can kind of like push them for a little bit more to go, well, do you have a roadmap for that? What's that looking like? And it also may depend on the software space that you're in. You know, if it was something built in the last few years, I'd probably be expecting that they would have a container-based deployment available or something that they could try. But, you know, if we're talking something that was many years ago, they may kind of still be stuck in the, well, this is how it works on the operating system on an EC2. So yeah, maybe not completely gone away. If you are using EC2 servers, you can still use that break glass option, and that's where you would still need. You could maybe get away from SSH and use SSM so that you don't have to expose that piece of it. But yeah, you would still be using EC2s.
And Drew, you just brought up the beauty of managed services, right? You can take advantage of the latest tech because all the work's already been done by the managed service. You know that, you know, the workload's going to work on there because they've done the back end, they've testing all the way through the service. So, you know.
Exactly right. If you can get away from hosting it, running it, or managing it, then you can focus on whatever your core business is, whatever your core product is.
You know, just like GP3 came out, you don't have to go worry about testing all of your application against EC2 with GP3 to make sure that, you know, everything is good. AWS has already done that, and now you're getting 40% better performance at a 30% less price because you're taking advantage of the greater tech. So,
yeah, and AWS like personifies that concept of like managing all of these services for you, right? They have more than hundreds of them to date. Okay, so I might do a quick summary. I'm just going to go for the post-it note version of this. So this is just another way of looking at mostly what we've been talking about, with a bit of an extra layer of the why we're doing it in the first place, so that we have, you know, product or app teams that want to use these services. So the way I like to think about our cloud landing zones with our guardrails, networking, and security is this kind of purple section where we have all these various accounts, like AWS accounts that are core, that are necessary. And then we've even got this sort of red section that complements that really well. And that's the account vending that we've talked about, being able to create and pull up new accounts for the different business units. There's also like a layer that we haven't really talked a lot about is like shared services and infrastructure. Very commonly within organizations, there are shared services like a build or CI server or build CI agents that you want to host and run. Artifact storage that you may be hosting and managing yourself. Now, of course, you could go out and use the SaaS versions of these products, and that's amazing. But if and when you do need to host and run your own shared services, you're going to be doing that within your own shared account. And so there's a piece around automating that infrastructure and having that available. And the other piece I've laid on here is this piece in blue, which is finally, we want applications, you know, application teams, product teams, developers, whatever we like to call them. They're going to have to run and manage their own pipelines to build and test and deploy their own software. And they may also have app-related or app-specific infrastructure that supports that software that needs to run. Maybe stuff that's not shared services, but maybe copying some shared patterns across the organization. So we've kind of got those sort of colors to separate out those different concerns. So if we kind of summarize what that looks like, you know, why should you think about building landing zones, automating them, or even concepts around transforming your organization towards these ways of working and all these principles that we just talked about. So the why, if I was going to sell you on this concept, would be, well, maybe you want consistent infrastructure and you want your software to be deployed in a consistent way, sitting on that consistent infrastructure, consistent environments that operate the same way in every single environment. Maybe your business, you know, probably your business is wanting to build new products and build them as quickly as possible to enter the market and compete. Maybe they want to speed up delivery and bring out more features, new features, also to compete as a business. So if some of those whys resonate with your organization, and if your organization is getting larger and larger with more products, more software, etc., then being able to have everything sort of automated from start to finish, all of your accounts, all of your infrastructure, and even your app side, it's going to be beneficial. They all work together, all these concepts work together. So if we focus on the summary for that purple bit, that really base level landing zone piece, we're going to need shared service accounts, networking fundamentals, security and logging, account guardrails like we've talked about, and automated account provisioning, otherwise called a factory or, geez, I forgot the other word for it, vending. So vending, factory, automated account provisioning, you know, self-service accounts is kind of a huge deal. We've seen that in the products, but it's a good goal to ensure that we have. And so what does that service for developers look like? You know, automated infrastructure provisioning is a step further that we can go. We did touch on the common shared services that we talked about, which would be built inside the landing zone. And those self-service cloud accounts, the vending that we talked about. So those are the keys that we would like to layer on there. And then one final step that we really haven't talked too much about, but just a little bit of a teaser here. We're doing all of this for the developers, for the product teams, remember. So one key point and one takeaway is that there is absolutely no point in building a beautiful, well-architected landing zone and having all of it in code if nothing lives inside of it. You know, there is presumably some sort of business, some sort of product, some sort of app that you need to deploy, and you're doing all of this so that you can deploy that application. It's in service to your product teams. So there's a whole piece around that being an enabler for product teams. And so finally, We need to be able to trust our developers to deploy their applications. We also want to make sure that we can supply development and product teams with all of the steps necessary, all of those checks and balances necessary to make sure they can get into production safely, with high quality, with security. And so there are concepts around automated application pipelines where we can build, test, and deploy those pipelines with some expectations for some shared infrastructure, perhaps like Kubernetes cluster that's hosted for us, you know, and environments that are consistent. And there's even more work to be done. It's probably a topic and a talk for another day, maybe a slightly different sort of topic or group around application-related infrastructure or infrastructure pipelines. There's a whole piece that we really haven't talked about that maybe sits, let's call it, in the middle of account vending and application deployment, which is a whole bunch of infrastructure that needs to be deployed and automated. And there are similar concepts around, you know, using technologies like Terraform, using concepts like guardrails and security, but in context of infrastructure as opposed to accounts. And so I kind of just wanted to expand out that topic a little bit. It's almost like backing all the way out now that we've talked about it to say, hey, we've got landing zones, accounts, and all those pieces. Then we've got like a layering on infrastructure and maybe shared services. And then we have app and app deployment. And if you can put those three together and layer them in that way, you have like the universe of what you do when you do product deployments in the cloud. And that's really like all the topics that I had to cover and talk about. So happy to field any other questions that kind of pop up here. And if, especially if you wanted to throw in some pieces about what you thought worked well for this topic, what we could improve for next time, feel free to put post-its up on there sort of as we're talking now. And once questions wrap up, I will sort of hand over for like sort of news and latest events from the team.
This is probably just a simple logistic thing, but I was trying to click on one of your links and it doesn't look like it's clickable when we're in Miro. Is that normal, or am I doing something wrong, or am I misconfigured?
The content is locked so you don't accidentally move it around, but you should be able to click on it once and then click on that pop-up that comes in.
Let me try that.
But yeah, it probably like can be very. Does that work at all?
The one that I'm trying is on the bottom of product teams - trust and verify. The last slide you had, there's a, how does one transform? And you said, I welcome you to explore the fawn.pub one. And that one, I don't think I'm able to do anything with it. It's not letting me.
Okay. I'll tell you what, to make life easier, I will collect up all those links after the fact to make sure that we kind of send them out to the whole group so that you just have them.
That'd be great.
Yeah, that'll be nice and easy. So we'll do that. So any of the links that you see here, we'll collect up and make sure that you can access later. Very excited that you want to click the links there. It's great.
Drew, have you done any migrations from current infrastructure and account structures to landing zones, or are most of your implementations of this newer customers that are just in the building process?
I mostly get to work on greenfield in this area, so that's really great for me. I'm very lucky. I have worked with teams before that did have some existing Terraform, and we did have all sorts of fun and games, but it really is pain in like, how do you take infrastructure that's like managed in one Terraform state and then kind of migrate it over to another Terraform repo, which is like a big piece of infrastructure management. So I've seen and had to battle with manual infrastructure getting imported into Terraform, and even going from one Terraform state to another. And it's difficult and cumbersome, and you need to be really careful with it. I haven't really played with it at the account level, and almost always my sort of inclination would be to almost try and build new accounts and just migrate apps and infrastructure like into the new account, like build them, rebuild them into the new account.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, you can use the strangler pattern as a method of.
Well, that almost kind of gets you into it's kind of back to your whole immutable, rebuild it and then move it to the new account, right? So Yeah. Good stuff, though. I really enjoyed it. It was very useful. We do hundreds of well-architected reviews every week, and it just is difficult to have this conversation. A lot of them are talking about, about this because it's, every AWS rep is out talking about it, and they're like, I want to do that. And then you're like, oh, the lift is going to be heavy with your current, 300 accounts in AWS that you already have,
Yep.
For what it's worth, I was just going to say the other links seem to work. It's just that one that's not working. It might have been a cut and paste or a screenshot or something, but I'm able to open most of the links. So I hate to make you go gather them all up if I can get most of them. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions, comments, thoughts before we wrap up with some sort of news and updates, or what's next?
Okay, great talk, Drew. Really appreciate you collaborating with us and jumping on the meetup. I like to talk about immutable infrastructure. I was introduced to like the kind of the safety of immutable, entities, through code, and then, really kind of taking that one step further. Like it just makes sense to apply that to infrastructure if you want that kind of safety to know that the environment is exactly as specified. So I think that's a really cool talking point. I think in terms of news and updates for the meetup, firstly, thank you everyone for joining, sticking around, listening to Drew talk about this. It's been very good. We have another meetup. The next one is coming in February, on February 16th. And Austin's going to be talking about CI/CD for different branching strategies, specifically around Git flow, trunk, and environment-based branching strategies. So with that being said, please tune in February, and I hope everyone has a great night. Drew, thanks again. This has been awesome.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, anytime.
Yeah.
Okay, hope everyone has a good night. Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to call out really quickly. This will be on YouTube momentarily. I'll upload it after the talk, and I'll send an email out and update the meetup link so that anybody can go back and watch parts if you wanted to get a recap at all.
Nice, good call, Austin.
Sweet.
Cool.
All right. Have a good one.
Hi, guys.
Bye, everyone.
See ya.
Thanks, everyone.